Between October 1871 and April 1906, 6 major American cities were completely reduced to ash. They weren't just damaged or partially destroyed, they were entirely erased from the map. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Jacksonville, Baltimore, and San Francisco. In every single case, the official story is completely different. A cow kicking over a lantern, a spark from a chimney, a defective steam boiler, a boiled-over glue pot, a discarded cigarette, or a devastating earthquake. On the surface, the explanations do not connect to each other. The cities do not connect, and the decades between them are completely separate. But the fires themselves do connect. Every single one of these fires burned at impossible temperatures that should not have been reached with the fuel available at the time. Every one of them destroyed massive buildings that were explicitly engineered to resist fire. Every single one was rebuilt within just a few years in a completely different, heavily standardized architectural style. And most importantly, every single one of these cities shared something highly unusual in common before the flames ever arrived, something nobody talks about anymore. This is the pattern that mainstream historians refuse to name. Take the famous story of the Great Chicago Fire of October 1871. We all know the legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a barn on DeKoven Street. The hay catches, the barn catches, the neighborhood catches, and within 2 days, 4 square miles of Chicago are completely gone, leaving 300 people dead and 100,000 homeless. But the standard historical narrative completely leaves out how the fire actually behaved. Eyewitnesses consistently described bizarre balls of light traveling far ahead of the flames, spontaneously igniting buildings before the main wall of fire ever reached them. They described freakish winds that pulled air directly toward the core of the fire instead of blowing away from it. Temperatures reached points so high they melted steel railroad tracks into puddles on the ground. Marble building blocks did not just crack, they literally crumbled into fine white powder. Heavy iron structural columns inside buildings advertised as completely fireproof warped and ran like liquid wax down their own stone foundations. Strangest of all, wooden fence posts were left standing entirely untouched, while every brick house behind them was vaporized. Green-leaved trees still attached were found surrounded on every side by miles of absolute ash. Right in the heart of the destruction, a single stone building survived completely untouched, the old Chicago Water Tower. Everything around it for 10 blocks in every direction was reduced to dust, yet it stood perfectly clean. Touring guides still call it a miracle, but perhaps the water tower was built to a completely different engineering standard than the city supposedly constructed around it. There is another piece of the Chicago story that remains buried. On that exact same night of October 8, 1871, 4 other major fires broke out across the American Midwest. Peshtigo, Wisconsin burned so violently it killed an estimated 1,200 people, making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. On that identical evening, Holland, Michigan burned to the ground. Manistee, Michigan burned to the ground. Port Huron, Michigan burned to the ground. All of these locations were separated by hundreds of miles, and all were blamed for separate local accidents. The odds of 5 distinct major communities catching fire on the exact same evening across multiple states with absolutely no shared electrical grid, infrastructure, or cause defies statistical reality. Just 13 months later, in November 1872, the exact same impossible fire physics manifested in Boston. The official cause was a defective steam boiler in a basement on Summer Street. By the next morning, 65 acres of Boston's financial district were totally gone, including 776 buildings. Granite buildings crumbled into dust, iron facades melted, and warehouses with double-thick brick walls collapsed inward. Fleeing witnesses on streets a full block away reported their heavy wool coats suddenly smoking from raw heat without a single flame in sight. Boston had spent the previous 20 years building what the local papers proudly called the Granite City, massive cut-stone commercial structures designed for ultimate permanence and heavily marketed as fireproof. They lasted exactly one night. When the financial district was rebuilt, the grand granite style was completely abandoned. The new city went up in simple red brick and highly standardized commercial architecture, smaller, simpler, and built much faster. The ornamental masonry and heavy European-style stonework vanished. The fuel load of a 19th-century commercial district made of paper, wood, and textiles cannot physically produce the 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit required to melt granite in open air. You need an industrial heat source or an artificial accelerant, yet historians maintain it was just an ordinary accident. The pattern moved westward. In June 1889, the commercial center of Seattle caught fire after a cabinetmaker's apprentice accidentally boiled over a pot of glue over a gasoline stove. 25 blocks were reduced to ash by morning. But here's the detail historians mention without ever explaining. After the fire, the city government decided to raise the ground level of the entire downtown by an average of 1 to 2 full stories. Existing first-floor doorways were completely buried to become basement windows. Original storefronts, cobblestones, and sidewalks were sealed off and paved over. If you take the famous underground tour in Seattle today, you can stand on the original streets and look up at daylight coming through the modern sidewalks. The official explanation is that burying the city helped with sewage drainage. However, the brickwork patterns and beautiful arch styles buried beneath the modern streets show a level of master craftsmanship that simply did not match what a 40-year-old frontier port town in the Pacific Northwest should have been capable of producing. Instead of restoring it, they chose to bury it completely and start over. 12 years later, in May 1901, the exact same impossible fire anomaly repeated in Jacksonville, Florida. Sparks from a factory chimney allegedly blew into a pile of drying Spanish moss. In just 8 hours, the fire devoured 146 city blocks and 2,300 buildings, leaving 10,000 people homeless. For perspective, the Great Chicago Fire took 36 hours to burn a comparable area. The Jacksonville fire moved at a speed nobody could account for, jumping multiple buildings at once and rolling across the city in massive waves. The Florida Times-Union reported brick walls glowing bright red from the inside out before any visible flame ever touched them. Cast iron stoves melted into puddles inside homes before the wooden walls caught fire. Within just 2 years, the entire city was completely operational again, featuring an entirely new street plan, modern zoning regulations, and a totally different architectural style. 3 years after Jacksonville, in February 1904, Baltimore went the same way. A discarded cigarette or an electrical fault destroyed 1,500 buildings across 70 city blocks in 30 hours. The Baltimore fire is heavily studied because it was extensively photographed. The photographs completely dismantle the official narrative. You can see massive iron structural columns standing perfectly straight and intact in the middle of empty lots, while the thick brick and stone construction directly surrounding them was entirely pulverized into powder. Fires consume materials based on flammability. Wood goes first, then brick and stone are the last to crack. You do not get a fire that vaporizes brick walls while leaving cast iron columns standing nearby, because iron melts at 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while brick can survive up to 3,200. If the iron survived, the brick should have too. Furthermore, telegraph poles a mile away from the burn zone caught fire strictly from the top down, with crossbeams igniting while the bottoms remained completely untouched. Finally, in April 1906, the pattern culminated in San Francisco. After a 60-second earthquake, fires raged for 4 full days, wiping out 500 city blocks and 28,000 buildings. The official cause was gas mains rupturing, but the earthquake hit at 5:12 in the morning when most citizens were asleep and gas lines were not highly pressurized. Firefighters reported 0 water pressure across multiple independent water systems almost immediately, as if the lines had been deliberately drained. The U.S. Army was deployed and immediately began dynamiting historic civic buildings that were completely unburned and nowhere near the projected path of the fire. When San Francisco was rebuilt, it went up faster than the construction technology of the era should have allowed, completely transforming the entire urban landscape in less than 9 years. When you look at the photographs of all 6 of these cities before they burned, you see something incredible. You see massive domes, intricate cast-iron facades, magnificent bell towers, and cathedral-scale architecture in cities that had only existed as American settlements for a few decades. San Francisco had only been settled by Americans for 60 years before the fire. Seattle had only existed for 38 years. Where did the immense wealth, the thousands of skilled stone carvers, and the architectural plans come from to build neoclassical palaces in what were supposedly fresh frontier villages? The textbooks say 19th century America was just highly ambitious and heavily funded by railroads and shipping, but the timelines do not fit. The population did not grow fast enough to supply the labor, and the wealth did not accumulate quickly enough. Yet immediately after they all mysteriously burned, they were replaced by standardized, practical, repeatable brick blocks and steel frame office buildings, structures that actually matched the true technology and labor pool of the period. Strangest of all, nearly every single city on this list either hosted or sat directly adjacent to a massive World's Fair exposition within a few years of its destruction and rebuild. Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, St. Louis hosted in 1904, Buffalo hosted in 1901, and San Francisco hosted the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. These expositions all featured hundreds of acres of monumental neoclassical buildings, giant domes, and intricate ornamentation. The official story is that these massive cathedral-sized structures were temporary fairgrounds built out of cheap plaster and wood, designed to be completely demolished within months of the fair closing. But looking at the photographs, the level of finish defies temporary construction. What if these expositions were not built from scratch at all? What if they were the final surviving remnants of the grand pre-fire cities gathered together for one last public viewing before being permanently dismantled and erased from memory? In every single city, a tiny handful of older buildings survived the fires due to highly suspicious coincidences, the wind shifting at the exact correct second, or the flames simply skipping a block. What if these survivors represent the original, highly advanced construction built to a standard that the fires physically could not touch, while the newer, more vulnerable structures built around them was what actually burned? The physical evidence, the timelines, the impossible temperatures, and the surviving photographs all point to a singular conclusion. History is far stranger than the textbooks let on, and the modern cities we live in today were built directly on top of a grand civilization we are no longer permitted to remember.